Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, a narrative history. And of course, we have with us to talk about the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, the author of this book, Dr. Bobby Lovett. Dr. Lovett is a professor in history at Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Lovett, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Well, thank you, Dr. Haney.
And Dr. Lovett, to tell you how delighted we are to have you here. I think most of our viewers will be reminded that over the last many years that you've been here on many occasions, and you've left them with excellent information. I'm reminded of just one or two that you've done that will sort of fall within the same category as what we're going to do today, and that is some kind of historical statement in reference to it. And I think that you've talked about the Declaration of Independence with us, African Americans in the Constitution, and just about every aspect of the American history experience, centering primarily upon the African American. And I'm sure that with what you're going to give us tonight, this morning, will be a continuation of that, dealing with the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, your book dealing with the narrative history of that movement. But before we get involved in that, Dr. Lovett, let's have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important that eventually led you to write this, along with many of the other books that you've written, and talk about those books as well.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm a graduate of Booker T. Washington High School. I did my undergraduate work at Arkansas A&M State College in Pine Bluff, and went on to do my graduate work, master's, PhD at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. I taught school in Memphis for about 1 year, returning home. Left there, went to Eureka College to start my college teaching career in Illinois. And I came to Tennessee State University in 1973, and I've been there since then. So I've been at Tennessee State University going on 33 years. And I really became interested in history because I'm from a very large family that comes out of West Tennessee. And I grew up in my early years, until I was about elementary school, living in a home that had 4 or 5 generations under one roof. And some of the older people in the family, like my great-great-uncle Julius, he would always tell us all these tales about West Tennessee and going back to slavery and all of that. And I think that sort of pricked my interest as a young 3, 4, 5-year-old child. And when I got to college, I eventually changed my major from engineering to history because it was just in me to be a historian, and I've been a historian ever since.
And of course, you've been very active in your history career, and we've talked about a number of books that you have written that you've talked about with us on this particular show, African Americans in Nashville, and some of the others. Let's talk about some of those books.
Well, I've been publishing articles and books since 1976, so I've done a number of works. Some of the most recent ones are the Profiles of African Americans in Tennessee, published in 1996. The African American History of Nashville, published by the University of Arkansas Press in 1999. And this book, The Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, a narrative history, published by the University of Tennessee Press this last November 15th.
And so in a real sense, Dr. Lovett, this, you were well prepared in terms of dealing with the civil rights movement in Tennessee by some of these earlier profile information and et cetera. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. The previous publications and, many articles, encyclopedic entries that I've done certainly helped me to gather a lot of information that led to this book. However, this book is really a new field for me because most of my work centered on the Civil War, Reconstruction, slavery, 19th century, and because this was needed to cover the civil rights movement in Tennessee, whereas few state studies exist. You usually have books on the civil rights movement in the whole South, civil rights movement on individual leaders, biographies, and so on. So I took this stab on this while I was working initially on a piece on Avon N. Williams, who was a civil rights leader in Nashville. And I decided it was time to do a whole book so people would know where Tennessee fit into the civil rights
whole
movement.
civil rights movement.
Right.
Of course, Dr. Love, we're getting ready for our first commercial break. After we come back, we're going to give you an opportunity to talk about the civil rights movement in general, and then to sort of zero in on the contribution that you've made here dealing with the movement in the state of Tennessee from a local historical point of view. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, a narrative history, and the guest is Dr. Bobby Lovett, a professor at Tennessee State University, the author of the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee. Dr. Lovett, let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, but before we do that, let's sort of give our audience some background kind of information relative to what really prompted the so-called civil rights movement nationally, and then how it impacted Tennessee according to what you have here.
Well, one of the ways I start the book off is explaining to the readers that the African American has always had a civil rights movement since the first ships landed in Jamestown in 1619, that African American slaves were trying to express their freedom however they could, including running away, slave rebellions. And but I say that the civil rights movement really begins in 1865 with the emancipation of the slaves. And African Americans in Tennessee and other places in the South began what I call the first post-slavery civil rights movement. And that movement continued up until about 1881. And it was to do three things: to secure citizenship for the former slaves, of course, to get an amendment so that slavery could never come back, the 13th Amendment, and to get the right to vote. And they accomplished all of those things by 1881. And by 1881, the Jim Crow era started to corrode some of those progressive changes. And from 1881 until about 1930, the second civil rights movement started. And that was basically to try to undo the damage that Jim Crow had done. And so a lot of civil rights organizations will be founded in that period of time. The Afro-American League in 1890, Du Bois's Niagara Movement in 1905, the NAACP will be formed in 1909, the Urban League will be formed in 1910, the Garvey movement in 1920, and so on. And that movement sort of peters out by the early 30s with the coming of the Great Depression. And then in 1935, the civil rights movement that we now talk about really started in 1935-36, when Charles Hamilton Houston, Dean of Law School at Howard University, Harvard Law graduate, was hired by the NAACP to come up with some legal strategies about how to attack Jim Crow. And that ultimately led to a lot of civil rights cases they won. They won 12 or 15 cases in the United States Supreme Court. And the big case they finally won it, and that was Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954. And that's what started the real public activity, heightened activity of the civil rights movement. And many people equate that period from Brown, 1950s and the 60s, as the civil rights movement. But that was just the culmination of a civil rights movement that African Americans had started in 1865.
And then in a real sense, even earlier, what you said, when they first came and got off the boat, that there was an interest in freedom and civil rights.
That's right.
No matter what you call it, at that particular time,
that's right.
Very good.
The slave rebellions like Denmark Vesey's rebellion in the 18th century, the Coors Nat Turner's rebellion, the Underground Railroad people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and William Lloyd Garrison. We don't really put a label of civil rights leaders on these people, but they were fighting for the same things as civil rights leaders were fighting for in the 1950s and the 1960s. And that's human freedom and human